Hello, welcome to the episode of the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast. I am your host, Neil Horwitz. You can find me on Twitter, NJ287, also on LinkedIn, where I post more content, the website, dsmsports.net, and of course, follow along on the podcast with your preferred podcast platform. Just a tremendous show for you guys today. I was so psyched to be able to speak to this guest, someone I've been reading for a while. You probably have too, and he blew me away with his interview, surpassed any expectations. My guest on the podcast today is Dan Roberts. He is editor-in-chief of Front Office Sports. If you're listening to this podcast, you better be. There's a very good chance that you are familiar with Front Office Sports and subscribe to one or more of their newsletters, read their content, follow their reporters across social, and Dan is at the helm of it all as editor-in-chief. He has been in sports business, sports journalism, sports reporting for a long time, and is really smart about really where journalism is going, what it means to break stories, how to make the most of it, how to engage with readers and consumers in this new and constantly evolving world of journalism and media. Dan is so smart in this stuff. We go into so many different directions. It's so good. So here he is, Dan Roberts of FOS/Front Office Sports. I am back on the podcast with today's guest, and I'm so psyched to be speaking with him. We could have been recording offline as well. Being able to pick his brain is already a privilege and an honor. My guest on the podcast today is Dan Roberts. He is editor-in-chief of Front Office Sports, aka FOS. If you're listening to this podcast, you are almost certainly a subscriber or a reader and or both of Front Office Sports, and I'm delighted to have you on today, Dan.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, and I'm with you. If they're not subscribing, they better after this.
Heck yeah, it is probably the biggest publication in sports business, and you guys cover everything, and it's a tremendous resource for me and all my peers and colleagues as well. And it's like to learn all about what you do with Front Office Sports, how you guys cover it, just your experience in the journalism space in general, with so much evolving constantly and changing. But before we get on the meat of our discussion, Dan, tell us about your career path. You're getting experience early, stops along the way, how you got to FOS, and any tips for folks that want to try to do what you do.
Sure, yeah, always happy to do that. It's always weird talking about yourself, but I'll do it a little bit. I've gotten used to recounting the resume, I guess. Always knew that I wanted to go to journalism, so and things now have changed a little bit. You see people hop around, or you see people come to it in a roundabout way. I always think that's kind of interesting. My path into this stuff was very linear and almost boring in how linear and direct it was. You know, I knew I wanted to write for magazines, so I graduated college in '09, which was not a great job market. If you all remember the recession, yep. And I knew I wasn't going to walk into like the kind of magazine job I wanted, so I went straight to grad school for journalism. I did a year at Columbia. It was worthwhile for me. I often find myself talking to young people who ask, should I go to grad school for journalism? And frankly, I tell them that if you can get even a great internship without doing that, then skip it. Or if you went to a school where you were able to study journalism undergrad, no need for grad school. But it did work well for me. I did a little bit working at a newspaper in the Bronx after grad school, a small newspaper in the Bronx. We were actually an arm of News Corp, so all of our stories ran at the New York Post site, which was kind of fun. So we were almost like the Bronx outpost of the Post. There was a photo of Murdoch in the lobby of the building that where our newsroom was in the Bronx. I wasn't there that long. It was like 6-7 months, and then I ended up at Fortune magazine. And I didn't think necessarily that I wanted to do business. I knew I wanted to do sports. And I also have always had, and I still write on the side when I can, an interest in pop culture stuff. So book reviews, movie reviews, arts coverage. But I landed at Fortune. And one thing I learned real quick is everything is a business story, honestly. I mean, it's so broadly applied. Everything is business. Business coverage does not necessarily just mean wonky, stock market and looking at an earnings report. It's everything. I mean, it's culture, it's entertainment. Almost every sports story now is a business story, as we say at FOS. So I was at Fortune 5.5 years.
Wow.
Then I went to Yahoo Finance, covered a lot of the same stuff. I was there also 5.5 years. Did a lot more on-camera stuff when I was at Yahoo, but also writing and editing. And then I was editor-in-chief of a crypto news site called Decrypt for a while. I've always been fascinated by crypto. I still am. So I like to say I took a 3-year detour into doing crypto stuff full time. I even spent almost a year at a VC firm. And then in July, I joined FOS as editor-in-chief, and it has been quite a ride. It's been only like 4.5 months, but it feels more like a year. And I say that in a good way. It's just we're doing a lot. We're moving fast. And To wrap this long answer, you asked for any tips or advice.
Yeah.
One that I have and that I give young journalists all the time is like, raise your hand, volunteer, self-advocate. And sometimes, honestly, that means being a little pushy and probably speaking up and piping up. And maybe there's some folks who don't take that approach, but it worked for me. I mean, when I first started at Fortune and I was, young, entry level, um, I definitely raised my hand a lot, probably to the point where it annoyed some people. But, I'd overhear that we were working on a big feature about, say, Bob Kraft and the Patriots dynasty, and that was being written by a much more senior writer. But I'd say, well, hey, I have an interest in this. I'm from Boston. I know about the Patriots. I know about sports. Is there anything I can do to get involved with this story? And the answer was, well, yes, actually, we need someone to do the two charts that are going to go into the story. And as you might know, when you are working on a chart or an infographic that's going in a print magazine, the average reader might not notice, but those take often even more detailed level of reporting. They're very time consuming because every little number and every little icon has to be right. But that's how you do it. That's how you get in, and that's how you start to get more assignments. And you have to advocate for yourself.
Love that. That's fantastic advice. I have to ask too, like, um, did you intersect with Mina Kimes at Fortune? So I think she
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, Mina and I overlapped. She's a great reporter. It's interesting to see her path and have her go all in on sports because when I worked with her, she was a great investigative business reporter. She did this great story about like medical implants, I think, in replace of bones or muscles that exposed something bad that a company was doing, a company that made medical implants or medical devices. And yeah, so then I know she wrote that famous viral blog on the Seahawks, and that was it. From there, went full sports.
Small world for sure. I also want to ask too. You mentioned going to grad school and that being a choice for you and having some benefits. And we always, especially in the sports world, I feel like there's oftentimes like a disconnect between what they teach in the classroom and what actually plays out in the industry. Do you feel like the academic like preparation for journalists now is that are they teaching the right things, or is it do you need to catch up a little bit on what's practical and what's more classroom?
Man, I gotta tell you, that's a really good question, and it sort of opens a whole Pandora's box because I do have some thoughts there. First of all, when I was at Columbia, it was 2010, and in some ways, to think back on some of the things that were part of the curriculum, it's almost like cute because you could at the time choose to focus on broadcast, and that's fine. Those are people who wanted to be on camera.
Mhm.
And those are the types who, when they graduated, they would take whatever local news job. They would go anywhere. They would go out to uh, Iowa or Poughkeepsie, whatever, because that's how you get your start. That's fine. Newspaper, which is kind of charming now because, I mean, and yes, there are still newspapers, but to think that could have been your focus track in 2010, I don't know if folks who chose that one regret it. Again, you can, of course, work whatever your focus track was into any job. It doesn't matter that much. Magazine, that was my choice, or new media. And the new media was basically digital and the internet. And the irony there is, well, everything is digital, everything is the internet. Every focus track involved new media. It's like, oh, if you did new media, you were learning things like Final Cut, and you were thinking about social media first, and you were thinking about how do you write for a digital audience. Everything now, the most important thing is the digital audience, even organizations that have a print outlet. And so I don't know anymore if they have that track, but if they did, it would feel silly because everyone, regardless of what it is they want to do in journalism, needs to understand digital tools, of course. And it's also funny. I distinctly remember sitting in a tutorial, maybe in our first week or two, and it was someone in a position of power at Columbia Journalism School instructing everyone in the room that they needed to make sure that they had a presence on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. I mean, this was early. I don't think they listed Instagram. Oh yeah, Instagram came around in 2012. God, I'm realizing how old I am. But the idea that you would have to tell reporters that today, I would hope, of course, reporters know that. And so a lot has changed. And I also don't want to sidetrack us too much, but the reason I say the Pandora's box, I also think there are questions now of whether even a four-year undergrad college is as useful as it's ever been. I mean, that has changed, and the price continues to go up at a time when the perceived value is going down. So I think there's going to be a major sea change in the way that we think about college and grad school in the next decade.
Yeah, totally. Even the like, as we all have seen, the brands in journalism have continued to fall, and there are still some really strong brands. I mean, heck, FOS is a strong brand, but it's also just as more important. Like, you can be like, it's almost like the brands need you as a strong reporter with a strong presence more than you need them, and that's probably the reverse. 20 years ago, where it was like you got excited to get a job at Fortune, and now it's like, well, Fortune maybe is more excited to get someone who has a strong presence and already has like the connections and a lot of following in that space or whatever. So that's a whole other thing as well. Segue into that too. Like, what was it like? Because you and I graduated around the same time. Social media was there. We were some of the early Facebook users, but it wasn't really strategic at that point yet. But it started to become so, pretty quickly with Twitter becoming more important, Arab Spring and all that. So like, what? How did social media come into the fray for you as a journalist? How is it portrayed and framed, in your job with your bosses, with your editors? And then how do you start to use it both, beneficially, and also maybe how it got in the way at times?
Yeah, there's so much there. And by the way, just real quick, and I don't want to, again, it's fun talking about this stuff, and we could go down so many different.
Oh, there's no time limit. It's a podcast. Derail us.
Well, just real quick on brands. I mean, I think what's funny about brand is like, and I'm glad you say we have a strong one. I agree, but I think two things there. One, like, it is possible sometimes to establish a brand almost overnight if the people behind it are known names. So I think Puck has done a good job with that, of kind of collecting shiny things, and the shiny things are reporters who already have an existing name in their beat. So that's a smart, it's basically just an umbrella company for well-known, highly followed beat specialists. That's been good for Puck. Um, Semaphore is another example where, because the people behind it have good track records, I think most people now in journalism who follow news daily, they know what Semaphore is. Maybe they're not reading it every day. I also think there's some things they've tried to establish, like the semaphore structure of a news story, where at the end the reporter gives their opinion. I don't know if that's going to catch on, but point being, everyone gets used to any brand name if the quality is good and if you know the people behind it. I'll never forget when Axios launched. Everyone made fun of the name, including me, because it sounds like a Harry Potter spell. Axios. It's like, what? But now we're all used to it. We know Axios. That's a good news outlet. So that's just one quick thought on brand. And it actually is a nice segue to talk about social. I mean, a couple thoughts on social. Like, you need to be fast. You need to have a unified voice, which is not always easy. That might sound obvious, but I think lots of news outlets don't really have a clear voice on social. They just tweet their news stories. And it can't be that way. We have a terrific social team. Look, in some ways, our social has been the secret weapon of FOS's growth. There's a way that we share things, and a way that we approach Twitter and Instagram, and recently other platforms, TikTok, that is really distinctive. I also think that reporters must be growing their own personal brand on social. And there are some old school people who still to this day don't believe that, or they buck against it, or they're unwilling. And you have to. And I'm all for growing your personal brand within the larger news outlet at the same time. You can be posting, and that's good for FOS, and it's good for you as an individual journalist. And there's also things that some journalists do on Twitter. I know I'm talking a lot about Twitter, and Twitter is least useful than it's ever been because of Elon and how he's changed the algorithm, and the click-through rate sucks now. But it still, in my mind, is the best thing we have in terms of a live, real-time news discussion place. It's still the town square, the public forum, I think. So to get back to my point, I think there's some things a lot of reporters do on Twitter that I constantly tell my staff, and as long as I've been in a leadership position, this is something I constantly remind people of, that isn't worth it. Like, when it comes to karma, glass houses, there's reporters who like to snipe, and, they're out there saying shit, or they're criticizing a story from another outlet, and it's just not worth it. I'm all for back and forth and engaging in things, but there's a lot of reporters, especially in media, especially in sports. And then the crypto space was highly, highly competitive. There were really only like 4 high quality news sites that were doing daily crypto coverage, and they all hate each other, and they're all very competitive. And it's like, I just don't believe in publicly sniping your competitors.
Yeah, no, totally. I don't think anyone really wants to see that unless they just like seeing driving by car crashes, I guess, at times. You did mention because FOS does have a good, strong social presence and does create content that's social first, and it is powerful for that. So when you're thinking about like, I mean, I guess I like to use this analogy quite a bit. Like, when there's NFL games going on, like we're talking shortly after, Thursday night NFL game, and when there's a big play, everyone is tweeting the same video of the same play and trying to have their spin on it. It's like I call it like the caption contest, element of Twitter in this case. So when there's a big story that drops in sports business that everyone's going to cover, like, is there a certain way that FOS is going to approach it that's going to help you stand out, that's going to meet your audience, that's maybe going to look better on social? Like, what's the approach when there is that story everyone's talking about, but you guys want to make sure that people come to you for it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the constant question. And as you grow, sometimes the answer to that evolves. Uh, One big thing is just thinking broad and thinking big. With every story we cover, we want to have an interest as many people as possible. So even when it might seem niche because we're writing about one specific quarterback at one school and a weird thing that happened involving that quarterback involving NIL, well, how do you frame it in a big way where you're reflecting, even in the headline and the social framing, that the reason this is interesting is because it has broader implications, or it's an example of a broader trend. And the reason I say that is we're cognizant of not being a industry trade publication. I don't even like to call us really a sports business publication. We cover the business of sports, but we say that we live at the intersection of sports, business, entertainment, and culture. And as I mentioned to you, either at the beginning of this or maybe it was before we started taping, but these days, every sports story is a business story, literally everything other than the box score, So other than did the Red Sox win last night or lose, almost everything is a business angle for us. And it's just about picking and choosing because we can't write everything. We pick and choose the ones that are broadly interesting. I don't really want us writing stories on sponsorships. X brand sponsors this team now or announces sponsorship with this player. There has to be another reason it's interesting. Otherwise, it's just an ad. And I'll give you another example of thinking that I aspire to, but isn't always possible. I was talking to a very good journalist recently who is not at FOS, and that person said, I try not to cover something if I ask myself, if I don't break this, will someone else? And if the answer is yes, because I know others are going to cover this, like, then why do I need to cover it too? Of course, you can't always follow that mantra. Sometimes something is so big that, of course, we have to write about it, even though we know everyone else is going to write about it. But it's nice in theory. You want to only be doing stuff where you can add value.
Yeah. I mean, I actually love that take. I mean, of course, in that, like, well, I remember talking to someone, maybe it was at Yahoo a while back, like years ago, Yahoo Sports. And they talked about like when a big story breaks, I want them to come to me for my take on it and whether it's their sources or their perspective or the fact to have a relationship developed with that reader. Like when there is that story that everyone's going to be talking about, or when the NBA signs their $76 billion worth of media rights deals or unrivaled launches or whatever it might be, like, is there something where you want to have that perspective so that I want to see what Michael McCarthy has to say about this? I want to see what this writer has to say about this, and developing that sort of unique take on and spin on things so that people can come to you, and choose you intentionally, I guess.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly the goal, and it's something you've aspired to. Could all of our readers answer the question, what's an FOS story versus a Wall Street Journal or a story at The Athletic or a Bloomberg story? I don't know. I think maybe a lot could. They'd probably have an answer and they could hazard a guess. And again, there are stories that all of us would cover, but I'd like to think we have a distinct voice. Certainly the newsletter, and again, FOS really started as a newsletter business. We have hundreds of thousands of newsletter subscribers, and our newsletter is really high quality. We get 2 out a day. That's a huge lift. Certainly our newsletter has a distinctive tone and voice and feel. And people that I meet who open it and read it every day, they love it. They read it beginning to end, and that's great. If you mentioned Mike McCarthy, who's our media specialist, if we drill down, I also think, and I'm constantly saying this to young journalists too, what you as a reporter should aspire to is you are both a generalist and a specialist, which might sound daunting. But in other words, it's very good to have some topics that are your passion points and some areas that you are the guy or the gal on. You are a specialist. But also, you should be able to cogently and intelligently write about almost anything under the broader IGIS that we cover. So, Margaret Fleming is one of our breaking news reporters, and the fact that it says breaking news, she covers everything. But she also has a real interest and now an expertise in women's sports and the WNBA. And that's great.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to do both. Mike McCarthy is explicitly our media reporter, and so he covers sports media. That's his full-time beat. But there's a lot under the sun when you say media.
Okay.
It's broadcast deals, it's media rights, it's personalities and talent and their contract negotiations. It's NFL and ad space and streaming. It's NFL selling more of its games to streamers like Amazon and Peacock. There's so much there. And just because his title is media doesn't mean that he can't write a story about NASCAR cutting a deal with some big company.
Yeah. I will say too, as a quick aside, the weekend columns and the weekend newsletters are some of my favorites. It feels like the writers get to stretch their legs and get to dive into things they're passionate about, and they're always great deep dives. So, it's
Appreciate that.
Um,
I'd love to hear that.
hell yeah. Oh, and I get to read you once in a while on the weekends too. So, also very good. I want to touch into you mentioned like breaking news, scoops. And I think every journalist I talk to, like there's still whether it's old school mentality or it truly is valuable. It still is. We need scoops. We need breaking news. Like, what is the value of a scoop now? And I always thought like it's ephemeral. Like once it's out there, then everyone will confirm with their sources and then add analysis to it, and the scoop becomes a passing thing. Like, so I want to hear, you have a great perspective on this. So is there still value in being that first, even if someone follows 30 seconds later?
Absolutely, there is still value, so much value. It's pivotal, it's crucial, full stop. However, or I shouldn't even say however, I should say and, everything you said is true that in the rapid fire, quick hit, aggregation heavy internet of 2024, being first to something has a shorter tail than ever. Like you break something, you're first, you bask for a couple hours. Places that rush to write it up have to credit you, and they say first reported by FOS, and it's great, and you love that, and you pat yourself on the back. And also, scoops, being first to things, having an exclusive, that's what hits for us traffic-wise the most. Even when we're really quick to cover big news, it's great when we're quick, but if it's just big news that everyone's covering, we don't get much of a hit with that because all the bigger sites are also covering it. You get the most juice out of something that only you have. But the amount of time you benefit from that is shorter than it's ever been. A. B, it's really, really hard to get scoops. I'm very cognizant of that. So in other words, I know that nothing is more stressful than telling a reporter, break more news, get more scoops. It's like, they don't just fall from the sky. Now, sometimes you will be gifted something either by someone who you've built a relationship with, and that's how you get scoops. You have to build relationships. You have to build sources.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's literally a PR person. And sometimes that's okay. Like you have a relationship with the PR person in some league, and they decide that they're going to feed you something first. Fine, we all do it. But for the most part, when we say sources, we don't mean PR people. We don't mean comms people. Real sources means having people inside a company, having people inside a league, knowing, the social media guy at the Jags. So the Jags give you something. By the way, that was a totally random example. Yeah. I don't want anyone to think, I don't want to hear from the Jaguars and they're like, what? But that's how you do it. And it takes years. So it's really difficult when you are 24, 25, and you want to be growing your profile on a certain beat. And you're not breaking news because depending on the beat, you're competing with much more established people. And I know that's frustrating. So my answer is yes, beats and scoops and exclusives are extremely important, but I know that they're hard. They don't happen overnight. They're not going to happen when you're brand new on a beat. And so it's hard to go from 0 to 1 and start from scratch and build your profile on the beat. The way to do it is you should be writing everything. You should be hungry. You should have an appetite. You should cover everything. You should be rushing to the computer when there's news on a Saturday in your beat. And I got to tell you, Neil, I see less of that these days. And I don't want to, sound like just old man yells at cloud. But I don't know if it's a generational thing. I don't know if COVID changed the way people feel about work in some ways. I mean, that's a broader conversation. But I sometimes see less of that hunger. If you want to be a respected, known person on a beat, you need to be hungry. I'm sorry, like you got to grind. And I saw Jim Vandehei at Axios recently wrote this exact same thing, or actually, he talked to Dylan Byers at Puck, and he said this exact thing, and I couldn't agree more. He said, "I see a lot of complacent reporters now who just kind of they'll aggregate or they'll write stuff up, or they're doing explainers." And it's like, well, if you want to be a brand and you want to have a reputation as a newsbreaker, you got to grind.
Yeah. I want to, like, there's so many avenues I want to go on, but let's piggyback on that really quickly around not necessarily the grinding spot, but the idea of I want to touch on the aggregators, and what your perspective is on that. When someone takes a bunch of news stories and does a summary, maybe, and even easier now with AI, hell, a Notebook LM will create a mini podcast for you on a news story if you want. Um, is that welcomed? Is that a threat? Does that drive traffic to you and drive more credibility to you? Like, what's your perspective for publications when they get quote unquote aggregated?
Yeah, I think in some ways, and I'm sure that some internet historian could say, "Oh no, it was already happening." But in my mind, and when you think something long enough, it becomes your truth. In my mind, like BI and BuzzFeed kind of started all of it. Maybe it was early AOL, but and I mean this in a complimentary way. In other words, like I think many journalists today don't quite realize the enormous impact that like Business Insider had on the entire way the internet works now when it comes to news.
Yeah.
They built a team of people who just write up everything. And being able to pull out that most clicky nugget from someone else's story, you can roll your eyes, you can say it's junky or trashy, but there's actually a lot of skill in that. So the New Yorker or New York Mag or Bloomberg or GQ will run a big long profile of Buffett. And BI would just yank out the two juiciest, most clickbaity sound bites and run their own post on it. And by the way, they fully credit, they say it was from the New Yorker, they link, but none of that matters. And they would get more traffic from that than the original source got from their long profile. And it's about understanding the internet today. And I'm sorry to say, and by the way, I'm not necessarily rooting this on or saying it's a good thing. And I say this as someone who is a huge reader of magazines and books. But I honestly think fewer people than ever want to read a 3,000 word story. They just can't and won't do it. So that's how Axios has won. That's how BI won. It's quick hit, distilling. Tell me what I need to know. Just give me the goods, And so that's sort of the origin of all that aggregating. And I'm not mad at it. I get it. Sometimes I think places clearly got it from us and they don't link and they don't credit. But that's a little different. That's when like a place tries to do their own story on it. And we wrote about the same thing 3 days ago. And I know that they saw our story and they don't link and they get away with it because like technically it's their own new original story. But the aggregation cycle is fine. And I love when we're linked and mentioned, especially when we're cited by name. Look, we have a whole Slack channel at FOS called Pickup, or maybe it's Coverage.
Yeah.
And people just link like, look, my story was picked up at Fox Sports. My story was picked up by Awful Announcing. They rewrite everything we do, They're very smart, and that's not a dig. I mean, they're very smart in what they do. Awful Announcing, they write everything, and they're fast. We say, wow, and we also love it. Like the other day, we broke something, and ESPN grabbed it and sent a push notification, and their mobile push alert said via FOS.
Yeah.
Love that. I mean, that's great for us. Love that. And so it's fine and it's good. Now, sometimes again, you can haggle over, do we deserve a link? The other day, I don't mind calling this out specifically. The other day, the New York Times wrote a whole long story about Scottie Pippen and how he's kind of seems to have gone a little crazy.
Yeah.
He's crazy for crypto. He tweeted an image of Elon Musk in a Bulls jersey and said, imagine if Elon Musk had been on the Bulls. People were like, dude, are you okay? I mean, so they use that funny Musk tweet as a jumping off to write about how he's gone crypto. And all the quotes in the story were from an interview I did with Pippen a month ago on stage at a crypto conference.
Wow.
All of them. And that's great and fine. And they linked to the video of the interview. So that's great. They didn't say where the interview happened. They didn't name the crypto conference. They didn't name the interview. They didn't say the interviewer was from Front Office Sports. And they would probably say, we're not obligated to. And they're not wrong. I think the context would be helpful and relevant in that story, but all good. But it is funny. I mean, when you're quoting that liberally, when it's more than just one quote, I think you could and should name those other details, in an interview with Dan Roberts of Front Office Sports, but whatever.
Yeah, no doubt. If anyone ends up quoting from this podcast, please credit Digital Social Media Sports Podcast and Front Office Sports. So, I want to touch on like that. I like that how you talked about Business Insider and how they did pull out those nuggets, and I think back too of like how this is how social media works now. Almost like you find what's the most juicy part of that story, and how do we package this now for TikTok, for Twitter. I think the an illustrative story was, I think it was The Athletic wrote about Kawhi, and they had that famous quote now that the board man gets paid, and became like a T-shirt, and I'm like, The Athletic should have seen that coming. They should have known that was going to take off. So like when you guys are working on stories, like do you almost want your reporters to like work with the social media team and also think like a Business Insider person? Like think about what should I tell the social media team that is your focus on? What's going to be your part, or vice versa? Even the social media team says this is your meat. Like I'm going to take this and turn it into TikTok. How does that sort of collaboration and even that thought process and framing go?
Yep. Social in many ways is like the secret weapon of FOS. Our social following is so great. And I think absolutely there must be very, very close contact between the social team and the news team at any outlet. We have a bridge room where we say someone sends a story they're about to publish and they say, here are the best nuggets from this. Because I can't expect our 4-person social team to read every word of every single article we publish. I can't read every single article we publish, at this point. So yes, you have to be closely in touch. And yes, it's a particular skill and one that is necessary to see ahead of time what's going to be the big soundbite here. And that sometimes, you don't want amplifying that one soundbite to be to the detriment of the rest of the story.
Totally.
But we had this highly successful September 10 event that we called Tuned In. Biggest live event FOS has ever done. It was in New York. We filled the Times Center, which is like 300 something seats. We got a lot of, millions of views of all the social content. And it was a sports media focused summit. We had Stephen A. Smith as one of the speakers. We had the chairman of NBC, the head of programming at ESPN, Jay Williams, Monica McNutt, also from ESPN. A lot of big names came to this conference and spoke to us on stage. And we got a lot of pickup and aggregation of some of the best sound bites. But honestly, Neil, that's what results in aggregation is the sound bites. It's got to be the sound bites. You have to say, Stephen A. Smith was asked about his contract negotiations. Here's what he said.
Yeah.
And he said something like, I'm a businessman, so I'm going to push and I'm going to get mine. I'm getting the quote a little bit wrong, but yeah, there are at least 5 different sites that are going to write a story on that. Stephen A. Smith on his contract, I'm going to get mine. That's a great post. That's a great social post. So you have to be very cognizant of the sound bites. And I'm so aware of how big something can hit that sometimes you have to be a little careful and wary because you better make sure that you have the quote verbatim correct.
Yeah.
And you also better be prepared for what's coming. And I'll give you an interesting story that I don't often talk about in my history as a journalist. June 2020, I was at Yahoo Finance. We were remote. It was the pandemic. It was so early still. If you remember, they weren't yet letting people get haircuts. The barber shops were closed. So side note here, but I looked like a homeless person. I had like an insane amount of facial hair. My hair was really long. Of course, the very next day, my local barbershop opened and said, okay, you can get a haircut if you wear a mask. And I went and got a haircut. I say all that because we were doing our digital Yahoo Finance live shows and we had Drew Brees on the show. Mm-hmm. And if you remember what was going on, it was the George Floyd protest. We were in the thick of it. Things were crazy, politically, culturally. It was wild. And we had Drew Brees on the show and he was coming on the show to promote some partnership with a small restaurant franchising company. Fine. As everyone in media knows, that's how you get athletes is they're promoting something. Fine. You have them on, you let them promote their thing, but they understand, and so do you, that then you're also going to ask real questions about recent news.
Yeah.
And to be clear, we literally told Breeze's team, we're going to ask about the recent political news and how it affects the NFL and protests. Great. So I asked Breeze, many people believe we're going to see the Kaepernick kneeling protests return this coming season because of the George Floyd protests. What do you think about that? And by the way, I thought it was a softball, Yeah. And a little bit to our surprise, he said, well, I'll never support someone kneeling during the anthem. And I think that's disrespectful to the flag. And we were like, whoa. And we quickly socialized, we put the clip on Twitter. And it was like the most viewed clip Yahoo has ever had. 12 million at the time. Everyone wrote that up. Every sports and news site on the planet wrote that up. And then he like quickly apologized, but it was kind of hasty and rushed. Then 4 days later, he had to apologize again for his first apology. And then there were people saying you shouldn't have apologized because it's clearly what you believe. So I was obviously getting blown up for weeks from people politically being like, liberal snowflake, you were trying to get him. It was a gotcha. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. I mean, it was a very straightforward question to ask. If we hadn't asked that question, we would look like, bad journalists. Of course, we would ask about recent news involving the NFL. So all that is just a long way of saying one soundbite can really go viral. So you can try to reverse engineer that a little bit, but also sometimes it's out of your hands and you have no idea how big something is gonna get. But you should have the wherewithal as a news outlet to amplify on social the best sound bites.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's important still to, even within your own team, to make sure that like when you amplify a piece of a story, that it's not without context, or it's not out of context. Right. Like, where it's important.
That's right.
And I want to also, like, you touched on, like, we talked about all different ways that content or stories become something. Like, you have an interview at an event, at a live event. You have like the old fashioned journalism route. You have like just other sound bites that might come about, and it's almost like this sort of what I've called in our outline was like multimodal form of journalism now. That there's a story, like that's the substance, and then that becomes a text article, it becomes a podcast, it becomes podcast clips, becomes a video explainer, it becomes whatever, a graphic, any different ways to think about these things. So like, what's FOS's approach to just thinking about presenting stories in all these different mediums, and how has that skill set become more evolved? And like, ultimately, as a journalist too, do journalists need to think multimodal, or do you just want the reporters to focus on information and let the rest of the pros like figure out the best ways to package it?
Yeah, I think that's a question everyone is grappling with. I mean, there's a joke in here somewhere of like, well, what do you want to see more of? It's like everything, all of it. I want all of it, and I want more of everything. And specifically with reporters, I think it's nice in theory to say, you just focus on the reporting and you do the story and we'll do the rest. But actually, that's just not how it is anymore. And reporters do need to think about the way that the story is going to be packaged. Something that I have had our reporters start doing more of that FOS did not do before I arrived, and I just think is a great thing. I mean, even places like the Wall Street Journal, you're seeing a lot more of this. Is you've done your story, it's published, you take your phone and you hold your phone out and you say, Alex Schiffer here with Front Office Sports, and I have quite a story to say on Live Golf and the PGA Tour. Live Golf and PGA Tour announced over a year ago they were going to merge. Well, where's the merge? Nothing has happened. I've got a little scooplet on the latest with the PGA Live merger talks. Head to frontofficesports.com to read my story right now. Quick 30-second video looking at your phone.
Yeah.
And, not everyone who is a journalist is comfortable doing that or wants to do that. And, on one hand, like, that's okay, but you're going to succeed more and your story will get more eyeballs if you are willing to do that. And I think that things like that are part of the job now. So we now do a lot more of those. They go on LinkedIn. They do pretty well. Vertical video. Everyone you talk to now with social media in a news setting, you got to do vertical video. It's all about video. It's looping in audio. It's putting the right kind of post on Instagram and amplifying with the most interesting image you have, picking and choosing what's the best headline framing for each separate social media app.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it all matters. It's all important. You have to think in a multi-platform approach.
Have you found that certain topics even like resonate differently across platforms? Like we know that TikTok loves a good whatever story about X, whereas LinkedIn is gonna do better. Prefer a story about Y, or is it ultimately just like it's distribution channels and like stories are generally pretty much of general interest across the board?
Yeah, I think there are certain topics that hit for us on every platform, no matter where. People love the sports media beat that Mike McCarthy does.
Yeah.
People love stories about expensive talents, the people they see on TV. They love stories about the NFL and the ratings. When ratings are down, they love to debate why ratings are down. Like NBA ratings really dipped to start this new season.
Right.
And man, I got enormous engagement on a tweet about, why are the ratings down? Shaq says it's too much 3-point shooting. What do you think the reason is? I think on Twitter, people like chiming in on controversial things. Whereas with our newsletter, and you were complimentary about the weekend stuff, you can probably tell. But on the weekend, we run more kind of featurey, lay back and read the whole thing type stories
Yeah.
that are interesting, that are more deep dive. So that we have great open rate on those. And then on Instagram, like there might be a really interesting story that is an article that is interesting in our newsletter that on Instagram, there's not necessarily an obvious, exciting visual to use with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Important.
so I'll give you one that was a great story. It got great traffic for us, and it was cool, and it was kind of scoopy. One of our breaking news reporters was able to stretch his legs and do a feature recently on Connor McGovern, who's an NFL player, not one of the stars of the league, but a player in the NFL, who many people had no idea his family is like the largest supplier of potatoes in the country
Yeah.
to McDonald's, Wendy's, like a bunch of different big fast food chains. It's a potato empire. We casually have been calling that story the Potato King story internally. And it's not necessarily like this enormous earth shattering. It's not like, oh my God, breaking news about the NFL or a scandal at the, but it is a little scoopy because it's about something that most people don't know. It's like, hey, bet you didn't know this. And there's a curiosity factor there. So all that said, it's a great story, but how do you represent that visually? All you can really do is like a photo of Connor McGovern and you put some potatoes in the photo. It doesn't necessarily translate that well to like Instagram.
Totally. Yeah. But that kind of like oddly interesting stuff does so well in these short form feeds now, like with TikTok and Reels, because that's just like that kind of random stuff that even non-sports fans would find interesting. That hey, this Potato King is playing in the NFL. Uh, I want to touch too on like these sort of like, I guess you can call it like the Tebow effect, when ESPN went all in on Tebow at one point because it just kept getting clicks. Like, are there things that you know that are going to be like, hey, Stephen A. Smith contract negotiation, like let's get as many stories out there about that as possible because people are going to click on it. Like, let's call his old like professors, let's try to get agents on who have represented other studio people. Like, is there that element of, hey, we need to have a healthy mix versus let's just go all in, or not all in, but let's over index on stuff that we know is going to drive clicks, even if we don't necessarily think that it needs more depth.
Yes, yes, and yes. Now, look, we don't want to overdo a story to the point where it's just we're being clickbaity and we've already written everything there is to say. Like there's a limit to everything. But absolutely, there is no shame in saying that when a certain story has enormous interest, keep hitting it, keep hitting it, keep hitting it. Stephen A. contract negotiations is a good example. That's from you. I'd say all things Caitlin Clark.
Yeah.
The Caitlin Clark effect is very real and it's enormous. And for a while there was some debate about, oh, it's not just Caitlin. When you cover Caitlin, you're neglecting the other stars in the league. Sure, there are other stars in the league, and they have also contributed to the WNBA's success. Absolutely, Angel Reese, and all of these other players that there are. Yes, Asia Wilson. Yes, but it's still the Caitlin Clark effect more so than anything else. We see it with the traffic numbers. We see it with the engagement. Huge ongoing story. People are riveted by Caitlin Clark. And then to a lesser extent, in terms of like event base, LeBron and Bronny. Were they going to play together? Are they really going to draft this kid? Are they really going to let him play in an NBA game when he's so clearly not ready for the NBA? And the answer was, yep, they did it. They played for 5 minutes together, whatever it was. But now it's over and he's back in the G League where he belongs. But that was a big story. And then there are things that are like really interesting to reporters that I often find like they're not as interesting to the general public as they are to we the reporters.
Mhm.
I don't know, like MLS and its Apple TV deal. Apple TV won't release the numbers. Has it been a success or is it kind of a disaster? Messi actually gets a cut of revenue of all new subscriptions for the MLS app. That's crazy. That's unheard of. How many subscribers? Apple won't say. I don't know if the average person even really cares about this, but we care about it because it's inside baseball stuff.
No, and it goes to that, like, you want to serve your audience overall, and you also want to make sure that you're covering your bases. And like, I guess, like you said, the answer is yes, everything, all of the above. And MLS, at least we'll get an idea on how the MLS final does when it gets Fox as well. Of course, it's going up against the SC Championship, so we'll see how that goes. A few minutes left here with Dan Roberts, editor in chief of FOS, Front Office Sports. What do you guys prefer, Front Office Sports or FOS, or all the same?
I mean, both. I love our name, and we lean into that we cover the business part. But I think the long-term goal, look, I hope FOS becomes a household acronym the way that ESPN is. I think for our readers, we're there, and other journalists, they know FOS. But it'll take a while for it to be fully ubiquitous. So
No, for sure. And as I mentioned too, I'm an old school front office sports guy, so it'll be front office sports in my head for a while at least. But FOS is all good too. I want to touch on just the idea of information brokering. Like people used to say, like Adrian Wojnarowski was, an investigative reporter, and yes, he was. He was a newsbreaker. But there's also so much information broker. Like I'm gonna break this for you, and then you're gonna give me this in the future. And I think and especially like FOS plays a big role in framing narratives, and like you guys can set the narrative on NBA. There's overreaction about the dipping ratings, or there is it should not be overreaction. It truly is like is NBA in trouble? Or like I mentioned, like emerging sports, like we should keep an eye out on the Premier Lacrosse League. Look at their traction, or the other way around. Like how much of that is like, do you guys understand your position to help sports grow or not grow and frame stories and narratives, and how much are you guys trying to like take in what information is being presented to you and present it in an objective way, or a way that's maybe beneficial to your sources?
yeah, look, you have a lot of power and responsibility as a journalist. That's always been true, and you're right that narratives just get formed and everyone runs with them. And so I think about that kind of burden and responsibility all the time. I feel like there were kind of two halves to what you just brought up, right? The first half is these scoop mongers.
Mhm.
And look, as Woj said, and there was a big story, we're recording this on Friday. There was a big story just yesterday in SI on Woj and why he stepped back. And part of it is like, he realized, life is short. And do I want my whole life to be that I'm literally, I feel I can't put my phone down for a second
Mhm.
because I might not be first to share some player's injury. And I've always had that thought about the scoop mongering of like, and I'm not detracting from what those guys do, but God's honest truth is they form relationships with agents, and the agent spoon feeds them. The agent texts them and says, Jimmy Butler is in talks with the Raptors, and you can tweet it. And then the guy goes, breaking, Jimmy Butler is in talks with the Raptors. And then the agent probably also texted Shams, 30 seconds later, but he likes Woj a little more. It's so silly.
And the agent wants that information out for a reason. He wants people to know. He wants Jimmy simply to know. Yeah, exactly.
That is exactly right. So, in fact, just last week, I was telling my whole staff, remember, when someone leaks something to you, what is their motivation and reason for giving it to you? Why do they want it out there? And increasingly, unfortunately, I think we see something where like agents are using the media to publicly negotiate. So they put it out there that Stephen A wants to be the first $100 million man, and everyone reports that. And ESPN sees that, and maybe behind the scenes, ESPN was really never going to go to 100 million. Are you crazy? But everyone reports it, and they say, wow. And then then they also sometimes take the temperature. Like everyone looks at the responses, and are most people saying, that's so ridiculous and outrageous? Or most of the replies like, yeah, he's worth it. He's that good. He deserves it. And they go, okay, he deserves it. 100 million. So, yes, there's the information, there's the horse trading a little bit, and you have to be very wary of that. That's part one. And part two, when we get to the responsibility of you being first to that or you shaping the narrative, I mean, one thing we're careful about, and I just ran into a friend from ESPN 2 days ago. I won't name her, but someone who's on air at ESPN and is great. And who knows if she was just blowing smoke, but she said, you know what I really like about you guys? You're straight. You have no angle or slant or agenda.
Yeah.
And I said, wow. And I hadn't heard that. I mean, that's certainly our intention, but no one had sort of told me that they appreciate that before. And it's true. I don't think we overthink not having an agenda, but it is certainly true. We don't do much opinion. Only Mike McCarthy does opinion columns, and I do columns on the weekends. But reporters should not be doing their opinion. They're just reporting this happened, and it's interesting, and here's why. You can always, of course, say, here's what others are saying about it, or here's what experts say. But we're not saying as an organization, the NBA is going back to China, and isn't that stupid? Nope. Or isn't that risky? Nope. We can say, here's what happened. If you remember in 2019, the NBA found itself the subject of a lot of controversy because of its relationship with China. And you know what? Who might have probably something to say on Twitter about the NBA going back to China? President Donald Trump, but because he said it last time. So those are the facts, and that's the history. And isn't that interesting? But we're not saying shame on the NBA, or we're not saying this makes sense and is a great business move.
Yeah.
So you sort of you play it straight. Here's the news, and here's what's interesting. I always say the litmus test, I say to my staff, the litmus test for everything we cover should be, is it new and is it actually interesting? There's tons of stuff every day that's new, that is news technically, but is it actually interesting?
Mhm. It is I mean, I think too, like, we've gotten to the point now where there's a whole, like, conversation here about where we are as a society and these platforms and what they've encouraged us to do with having I guess the hot takey nature of what journalism is becoming, or the Stephen A. Skip Bayless of it all. Like, there is a benefit, for better or for worse, to having polarizing takes on social media. It's going to drive more engagement. It's going to drive more impressions, and maybe that drives more clicks. Like, is that a stance for FOS, that, like, we're not going to go down that path of having hot take opinions knowing that we're going to leave some engagement on the table because we're not making some crazy hot take.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the very phrase hot take has somewhat, I mean, it's still around, but I think it peaked. Would you agree with that, Neil? There was like a hot take era.
Yo, because everything's a hot take now almost.
Yeah, well, right, and maybe that's why you hear it called hot take less, because I mean, it's the embrace debate era, right? I mean, why is Stephen A. so highly watched? Why are his ratings so good? Because it's, here's what I think about the Cowboys, and I'm certain of this. Everything is like, this is a guarantee, and here's my opinion as fact, and then let's argue. But that said, uh, it's it's also that it makes it more valuable than ever to just point out, here's what's happening. And we're going to leave it at that. What do you think about that? So that's sort of the approach that I appreciate. And everyone has their hot take, so they're going to bring the hot take in anyway. Uh, I certainly think that it's unfortunate, but this seems to be our world now. Many or most people choose to just read places or watch channels that already have the view that they possess. Over. So you're not going to hear anything else. You're going to hear exactly what you agree with. And you go, yup, that's right. That's the case. And so people who believe the New York Times is a biased left-wing rag, you're never going to convince them otherwise now. And at times, the Times has gone out of its way to try to get them back. You're not going to get them back. If they believe you're a liberal left-wing biased rag, that's it. And then there's people who have a certain image of a story that runs at Barstool Sports or Fox News, and that's it. They're not going to change their opinion. So, you don't waste your time with that, and you got to do what makes sense for your brand.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm thinking of, like, Outkick and some of those polarizing platforms out there, and
Right.
they have a certain audience that wants that basically is going to go to hear what they want to hear and have their takes kind of reinforced. And I think having just information, as you mentioned, like, information, objective information, laying out facts, like, there's so much value to that, and it's becoming harder and harder to find something that you can trust as just laying out the facts without an agenda, without having a preconceived perspective that they promise their readers or their consumers.
And people are gonna accuse you of bias anyway, by the way. I mean, as we all know, it's like completely unfounded. I'll never forget, in the first Trump era, 2017 or so, I was at Yahoo Finance, and a big story was obviously the Kaepernick protests and all of Trump's tweets about it. And that story had so many far-reaching tentacles. It was politics, it was culture, it was social media, it was race, it was money and business, it was Nike's involvement, and they were running ads with Kaepernick. I mean, that was like a story that regardless of your beat, you had to cover. And every time we would write about a development, whether it was NFL ratings are down, or Trump just tweeted again criticizing the NFL, the comments would be so vicious, mostly people being like, shut up, Yahoo, liberal, snowflake, bias. And it was like, bias? Just for writing about it? And the stories were extremely straight, clear, down the middle, objective. It was just like, this is what Trump said about the NFL. And even, the people who feel strongly are going to say bias, even just for covering it. So you're not going to gain anything trying to prove otherwise to people or avoid that. You just have to do what is good journalism.
Yeah, no doubt. One last thing for today's episode, shareable stat, with you, Dan. And this is a big picture thing. I want to get your perspective on like what is the future of journalism? Like, are we gonna have a bunch of like Substackers on their own, and maybe a few like the FOSs and NYTs of the world will still stick around as cover brands, or as you mentioned earlier, almost like the Pucks of the world, where it's like multi-channel networks to some degree, or MCN type model, or and then you have these sort of the fake news crowd, which is a lot bigger than we all realized. Unfortunately, that outwardly reject these publications, and professional reporters. They want someone with an iPhone who has their own perspective or whatever, even though reporters are on the ground with expertise. Is the industry at a pivot point right now? Is it in danger? And what's going to make or break the industry going forward, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a big picture, really interesting question. I think there is certainly room for startup brands to carve out a space, grow, and become widely known and become household names. And I'd like to think we're one of those. Again, the founders of FOS, they started this thing in 2018 in their dorm room at U Miami, and they've done a lot right, and they've grown the business very wisely. They're not journalists; they would say the same, but on the business side, they grew this thing in a very, very smart and deliberate way. And now we've really hit the gas on editorial and news and getting scoops. So all that said, like, that's a good example of a brand that has grown and has really grown its name brand awareness. That said, and I think this is something everyone who works at any digital news site that has been around fewer than 15 years deals with. And that is that certain incumbents will, I don't want to say never. I mean, Life magazine closed, and there's much better examples. That was like a billion years ago. But there's other examples of big magazines that closed forever. Like, I don't want to get it wrong and then get in trouble. Like, but I feel like Inc, INC, or maybe there's still Fast Company. There's Inc. There's one other one. Oh, Details just shut down forever. Like 4 years ago. Remember Details? There's definitely better examples that I'm now not thinking of. Playboy is barely anything anymore. There's no journalism. It's just like a brand and they slap the brand name on some products, but it's not a magazine, and it doesn't run, short fiction and do great stuff. None of these are the best examples, but the point is, never say never, but some news brands are always, it feels like, going to be the big dogs. And they're just, you can criticize, but look at the New York Times. I mean, it's a juggernaut, and people criticize the Times and their coverage. And I got a lot of complaints about the Times in the last maybe 5 years, but it's the New York Times. And same with the Wall Street Journal, to an extent, same with Bloomberg. Those things are just not going to go. I'm not sure there's many others I'd put on that list. The Atlantic has been very, very good recently. But point is, it can be frustrating because a place like the New York Times or Bloomberg, will finally write about something that we wrote about 2 months ago. And everyone sees their story, and everyone on social is sharing their story. And I'm not going to be so petty and time wasting as to respond to all those people and go, well, look at our story, read our story. But it can be frustrating. And the lesson is, yep, that's how it goes. Those are the big guys, and they have enormous baked in audiences. Doesn't mean they're better. And very often they write a story and I read it and I'm like, our story was better, but they get eyeballs and attention when they turn their attention to something. And I don't think that's going to change when it comes to that select few echelon of places that'll always be around, that just have huge, it's like Facebook, and apply it to tech. You can be a small startup that has one specific product and it's great, and your app is great, and the people who use your app love it and they find it useful. Okay. And then Facebook copies it and eats your lunch because they have an enormous built-in user base.
Oh yeah, people are celebrating, the growth of Blue Sky and all that, and Facebook's like, yeah, you gained 10 million users last week. We do that over breakfast on Threads. And it's remarkable. And you and I are maybe part of the last generation that grew up like with these strong brands all over the place, and the Gen Z and below, who knows, like they will grow up following people on TikTok and following individuals, following YouTubers, and it's going to be an interesting future. But those strong brands certainly have a big lead and have resources and can attract those people as well. But yeah, we this is a whole other episode to talk about the future of journalism, Dan. But we will have some more fun with you in our sidebar segment coming up right after this episode's shareable stat.
Awesome stuff with Dan Roberts, editor-in-chief of FOS. Nailed it in his interview. So many good lessons and insights. Really interesting to hear his perspective on the present and the future of media and journalism, about what it means to get scoops and how important it is for them to do so. Just awesome stuff. But stick around because we're going to have more fun with Dan in our sidebar segment. But first, this episode's shareable stat. This episode's shareable stat is kind of a unique one. It came from the recent Sports Business Journal put on event recently in Las Vegas for the Intercollegiate Athletics Forum, their annual event when they bring together leaders from throughout college sports. And this stat stuck out to me in particular. It was shared from an executive vice president at Learfield, and they talked about the effect of having NIL involved when you are renewing deals with brands. They said that on average, when they renew a deal with a brand for a sponsorship partnership deal, they get an average increase of 6%. The cost, the price they're getting for that deal goes up 6%. But when they involve NIL with the athletes, that goes up to 17%. So the shareable stat, that is a 183% additional value from having the NIL of the athlete involved and part of the partnership and activation. Certainly a bigger thing coming in college sports these days. So that in and of itself is a shareable stat, especially as 2025 we expect to see schools get much more involved with revenue sharing, with buying out the NIL of their student athletes to be able to do these kind of deals with brands and sponsors. But you can also think about it from anywhere you work in sports. Yes, it may not be as feasible to say we guarantee that XYZ athlete is going to be in this social media activation for a given brand. Maybe it is. Maybe there is a deal to be had there. But you can also think about what are the other NILs that are at your disposal that can add specific explicit value to a given deal. Do you have a mascot that is very valuable to include in a deal that would merit that kind of increase in value? What about your dance team or your street team? Or maybe there's an alumni that works closely with your team that's involved in your content. Or your broadcasters that work for your team, on the radio side or whatnot. Just lots of interesting stuff to think about the value of the additional NIL, all the value that it brings, whether it's using their social channels, using their pure name, image, and likeness to add value to the deal and the execution. Just really interesting stuff. And again, that shareable stat, 183%. When Learfield renews deals, they got on average 6% increase in value. When it involves NIL of an athlete, that goes up to 17%. It's 183% premium for the NIL inclusion. But more importantly, stick around for more good stuff with Dan Roberts of FOS in our sidebar segment.
Back with this episode of Shareable Stat, and I'm joined once again by Dan Roberts. He is editor-in-chief of FOS, or Front Office Sports, whichever you prefer, FOS for short. Dan, you kicked ass interview. Are you now ready to compose some sidebars with me?
Yes, let's do it. Let's do the sidebars.
All right. Number one, tell me the most memorable story of your career, for whatever reason.
Wow. That's a hard one. And we already talked about the Drew Brees incident, right, in this episode. I guess, I'd probably say that going to spend time with and interview the sports agent Lee Steinberg was pretty high on the list. It's a story that I actually co-wrote with Pablo Torre, who now obviously everyone knows Pablo from his ESPN days. At the time, I was like a pretty junior writer at Fortune, and Pablo was a rising star at Sports Illustrated. He had just done a number of cover stories in a row, all on Jeremy Lin. It was the Linsanity era.
Yeah.
So we decided to go and check in on Lee Steinberg, who is famously called the real-life Jerry Maguire. Yep. Pablo and I went to Irvine, California to hang out with Lee, who was trying to make a comeback. He had a pretty down on his luck stretch, a hard story. He was an alcoholic. He fell pretty far, hit rock bottom. He was like close to broke, had almost no clients, but he was trying to slowly rebuild his agenting business. So we went and spent time with him, and we wrote a profile. We learned a few things. We learned, of course, by talking to Cameron Crowe and others, that it really wasn't just Lee. Cameron Crowe also spoke to a couple other agents for that movie, and Cameron Crowe was like, it wasn't, he wasn't the guy. But I don't blame Lee for sort of amplifying that he's the real life basis of Jerry Maguire. And he's a very sweet guy. That was ages ago, 2012. Fast forward to now, one of his clients is Patrick Mahomes. So yep. Lee Steinberg at, 60 something is totally back. He's been a success. He's been sober for however long, and I'm very happy for him. But that was, a deep dive profile where I really spent time with the subject. And then we also spoke to a lot of people in the subject's orbit. I don't know if it's like the most exciting thing in my whole career or not when put on the spot, but it's something I think of right away. And then also the viral Drew Brees interview for sure was quite a moment.
Oh yeah, no, I remember the Lee Steinberg stuff, but when he did go through that, and there's a good chance I read that story, so definitely good stuff and important and meaningful memory too. Number two, you can take this any direction you want. I have a lot of ideas, but we won't have time to go through all of them now. Tell me, what role do you see generative AI playing in the future of reporting?
Yeah, it's such a big thorny question. Put very simply, not to punt, like it's not going away. It's going to stick around. So get used to it. If you're like, oh, AI or you're anti AI, I don't know what to tell you because there are a lot of obvious uses. We use it with transcribing a video.
Totally.
And I think it's gotten much better over time. It still gets certain stuff wrong. So you can't rely on the AI transcript and just publish. You better listen to the audio yourself and check your work. But I think that's a very useful case when it comes to journalism. It's funny though, you can instantly tell for now until it gets so good that you can't tell. But for now, you can instantly tell when a writer, used ChatGPT for something. There are some hallmark signs, and I find that extremely lazy. And I think those people should not be doing it. Famously, there was either a Variety or a Deadline story about a new movie coming out, and it was about casting. And it said like, the cast will have Jennifer Lawrence, Mark Wahlberg, and even Nicolas Cage! Exclamation point. And those are hallmarks that even in Nicolas Cage and the earnestness and exclamation points, those are big tells that someone used ChatGPT. A real human writer would never write that, even Nicolas Cage. And I think there was another sentence that was like, a thrilling staff of big stars. It's just not how you write. If you cover that industry, you'd say, Nick Cage, Jennifer Lawrence, and Mark Wahlberg are all signed on to star.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very lazy. So I guess that's my way of saying I don't worry yet that it's going to replace human writers. That said, for certain headline only stuff like plugins at some places, I know some are using AI already, and it mostly does the job. If there's a human story and you just want to represent it in a ticker on your site as a headline, it's gotten pretty good with summarizing.
Yeah, I could see like as generative video gets even better to be able to take your guys' stories and turn them into videos. To be interesting. I also would love to see like taking all your old transcripts from interviews or transcripts period and creating oral history stories like that. I think is could totally be a cool use case. That's a free idea. Take that and run with it.
Okay. Okay. That sounds useful.
Number three for you, Dan. I'm interested in this one. We didn't touch on this too much. We maybe talked about it a little bit before we start recording. Which countries besides North America, which countries does FOS get the most consumption? And overall, how much coverage of international stories, like whether something about La Liga or Bundesliga, or even the Indian Soccer League, do you guys try to account for? So, which countries get the most consumption, and also just the perspective on international stories that maybe are less North America centric?
Yeah, I mean, as you could probably guess, a healthy readership in the UK and Europe, and then we put Canada in there, although that start is part of North America. But the private equity flood into sports is in many ways also a Europe and the UK story because of soccer, because of international soccer. And then, by the way, everywhere you look, suddenly there's Saudi and Middle Eastern investment in US sports, and that's a story we covered closely. It seems to me that. Um, Sure, there's still some controversy there, but it's just becoming the norm. In other words, there was a time when it was like Saudi Arabia money, that's with the oil and the stuff they do over there, and is that seen as unethical? Well, the decision has been made. Sports leagues and sports teams have decided that they're good with it, and that it's a great source of capital. So you're seeing, the Qatari fund and the Saudi wealth fund, PIF, all of that stuff flooding into sports. So that's a big story that we are covering. To ignore it would be a glaring omission. So I think the audience for sports stuff over there is growing as well. And I'm also interested in the growth of, I don't want to say niche, but sports like cricket and rugby coming to America. There is a real growing appetite for that stuff. So we want to cater to all of it.
I like it. Yeah, there's interesting stuff happening all around the world, and becoming all coming to the States ultimately, oftentimes as well, as you mentioned with rugby and cricket and all the Saudi stuff in it as well. Next one for you, Dan. Tell me, excluding sports business publications, of course, the media company whose strategy most impresses you or intrigues you today, and why?
Oh man, that's a good question. I don't know if my hesitation is revealing to your listeners that I didn't look ahead of time at each of these, but I also like that's more fun and it's spontaneous. But I know you sent me these. Um, gosh, wow. I guess in some ways, I think the information has done a terrific job. And as a tech publication, they give you the information. I mean, the information. You're familiar with them. It's it, it's smart because it's approaches niche and targeted, and it's people who feel they need this information, so they're willing to pay. It's like who's in charge inside Uber. We've got the org chart at Uber. You might say there's not a huge audience for that, but some number of single digit thousands of people want and need that, and they will pay for it. And that's how you make subscriptions work. I mean, one thing I think we've seen in the last 10 years on the internet is you're not going to win by just trying to be kitchen sink and do everything. You better actually have a focus and a niche area. What's that thing that they got a bunch of money, they launched, they hired like 150 journalists, and then they closed after like 2 months?
Messenger, I think it was.
That's it. Thank you. The Messenger. Um, I could tell, I don't need to see their books. I don't need to see their content. I can tell you why it failed. They wanted to cover everything. They said, we'll hire a ton of journalists and we'll spend a lot of money and we'll cover everything. Can't do that. I mean, at this point, the places that cover everything are established. And for a new digital media publication to succeed, they better be focused and deep in a couple areas rather than broad and shallow. So another shout out, I know you only said one. I mentioned Puck earlier. I think the newsletter boom a little bit is slowing down. So not every Substack and newsletter is going to succeed. But what Puck did well is at the peak of the newsletter boom, they said, we'll create basically a newsletter umbrella where we'll do one Hollywood newsletter, one sports newsletter, one deals Wall Street newsletter. And they hired some of the best people in those beats. And those people have loyal, dedicated readership. And they brought those people in. Smart.
Great shout outs there. Yeah, the information is I love that newsletter. And just that publication. The creator economy stuff they do is second to none. It's really awesome. Kai Uref and that whole team there, Aiden Brown. All right, next one for you, Dan. Tell me, let's say you have a scoop coming. You have the Slack's come back where I'm just waiting to confirm his last source. What is the anatomy of this process like to maximize that scoop? It's like, okay, let's try to get something ready for Instagram. Let's also get a story up on the site. Like, what does it look like to say to maximize the value of the value of a scoop for FOS?
Yeah, I mentioned we have a specific channel that is for the edit team and the news desk to tip the social folks to what's coming. We say exactly what the best part is. What do we have that's new and wasn't out there? And then what are the best sound bites, the best quotes from the story? So they get ready and they prepare multiple pieces of content. When we think it's big enough, we tip our PR folks to see if they want to pitch it around and like alert other outlets that might pick up and aggregate the story. And then do we have video? Is there a video element we can do? So that's basically the process. And we talk about making sure it's perfect and ready before we drop the bomb.
Yeah. Did you want the reporters generally to be the first person to tweet it, post it, or do you want it to come from the FOS brand account?
That's a good question. And I think the answer sometimes depends on how much of a, known brand name the reporter has been on this story. So, for example, one of our reporters, AJ Perez, has done a ton of reporting on the Mississippi welfare scandal that involved Brett Favre.
Yep.
And this money that was used to build a volleyball facility or a sports facility at the school where his daughter goes, and there were apparently kickbacks and payments that there was money used that was supposed to go to families that needed it, welfare recipients.
Yep.
That went to that sports facility. So because of that, every time he has a news story that's a new development, he should probably be the one to tweet that first. But as you know, no one on our staff has the same reach that our main social account does. So
yeah, no, it definitely makes sense for sure. All right, tell me the most viral story or content by FOS during your 4 or 5 months as EIC there.
The most viral story that we've had.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a couple really good ones. It's funny, I already mentioned AJ. he did a lot of reporting on this, on Colorado in the Deion Sanders era in general. But then specifically recently, he had a Scoopy feature. We had a freelancer, and AJ worked with her and co-wrote the story with her, Jill Painter. And she went to Hawaii and talked to this now fired Colorado Buffs assistant coach who took it upon himself to do a trip to Saudi Arabia to try to get NIL money for the school. And the school disavowed him and said that we didn't send him there, that had nothing to do with us. And he didn't say otherwise, but he did talk to us about the trip, and it's a wild story, honestly.
Oh yeah.
I mean, just wild. Like, and to me, it crosses a number of boundaries. It's Saudi Arabia wanting to put more money into sports because they took this meeting and they considered, giving money to Colorado football. It's so random, It crosses NIL and the NIL era. So that was just huge. And then we've also had a lot of Mike McCarthy's media stuff go viral, honestly, because people just love that beat. He had some Scoopy reporting on what's going to happen with inside the NBA after Turner and TNT don't have NBA rights anymore. So that was a big story. And our golf writer, I want to shout him out, David Rumsey, has had a number of scoops when it comes to the golf business, especially when it comes to like Live and the PGA Tour. He is on that beat big time. So that stuff has played well. And all of this proves your earlier question. Got to have scoops. Got to break news. That's what goes viral. Scoops.
Oh yeah. All right, Dad, we're coming out of the wire here. I come out there to New York and we go get something to eat. Tell me the best meal to get in New York and where to get it.
Oh, good. I have a quick answer for that. My favorite restaurant in the city is a place called Danji, Danji. It's Korean tapas, and it's fantastic. My wife and I go there before we'll see a Broadway show. It's in Midtown. It's at 52nd and 9th. And I'm delighted to say it was closed for nearly a year due to something very unfair. There was like an electrical fire next door, not in their restaurant. But as a result, the restaurant didn't have their electrical hooked up. And they should have only had to be closed for like a couple weeks, and they were closed for like 9 months or something. And it was a tragedy. And they just announced that they're going to reopen, or they just reopened. Can't recommend it enough. It's like incredible kimchi, wings, Korean barbecue stuff, pork buns, good fish, good sashimi.
Oh yeah.
Let's see. I'm literally Googling live as did you reopen? Let's see. October. Planning to reopen by November 15th. So I'm going to 2 Broadway shows in the next week. I will definitely end up eating at Danji. Highly recommend. And then I realize I'm going all Asian here, but we also love ramen. So many good ramen places in the city. Izakaya is a good ramen place. I think there are a couple locations. Ippudo, Ippudo. There's a bunch of locations of Ippudo ramen. So go get ramen. It's easy, it's quick, it's delicious. But it's New York, baby. It's the best food in the world. You can't go wrong.
Sign me up. I'm definitely down for some Korean tapas for sure there, especially. All right, a couple of quick.
You know what's cool? You asked me about that. We will do it. Like, let me know when you're in the city. We will get ramen, and you can tell everyone on the podcast that we did it.
Oh yeah. All right, number 9 for you. I'm really interested to hear this one. Excluding FOS writers, your favorite writer to read.
Oh wow, yeah, that is good. I think Bill Cohan is very good. Cohan. He writes stuff for both Airmail and Puck. I know him from my Fortune days. He used to write for Fortune. His byline is William. William D. Cohan.
Okay.
He's good. I love most of Michael Lewis's books, although I think he blew it with Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that book, but I'm a Michael Lewis fan in general. Gosh, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, we're really talking about journalism and nonfiction, but if you ask me about fiction, I'm a big reader of fiction, and I love Jane Smiley. I love all her novels. I liked all the Ferrante novels. So there are some examples when it comes to fiction. But nonfiction, those are 2 good business writers. James B. Stewart, another business writer legend. One of his books that wasn't even one of the biggest books is called Tangled Webs. And I always think of that book. I thought it was great. There's 3 great sections, and it's all about people who lied, or got in trouble. Martha Stewart, Barry Bonds, and Madoff. So I highly recommend that book, Tangled Webs by James Stewart. Um, there's another great business writer, Roger Parloff, that I worked with at Fortune. He's like freelance. He does stuff for Yahoo Finance. He gets the goods. He's a great explanatory business writer. So yeah, a lot of those folks.
I like
That's
it.
who I would name.
There are just some guys out there, some gals out there that when I see their byline, I'm like, oh, I'm in for a good one here. I love it. And it's always great to see that. All right, last one for you, Dan. Maybe the hardest question I'm going to ask. The sports business story that will capture the most attention in 2025 will be what?
Yeah, that's really good. I am fascinated by the ongoing fragmentation of viewership. It's kind of a mess. The way I like to say is we're living through the transition period. It's very weird right now. I mean, look at the landscape. If you live in a certain city and you want to see your local hockey or baseball team, you probably have to watch the RSN, the Regional Sports Network. Meanwhile, the RSNs are mostly a bad business. They've changed hands a number of times. They're a hot potato. No one wants to own them. They keep selling or closing, and then where do the games go? And then on a national level, you look at the NFL, it's like, well, where's the game? Where's the dang game? Sometimes it's exclusive to Peacock. Sometimes it's on Amazon Prime. Sometimes it's, NFL Network. It's kind of all over the map because the big leagues are parceling out more and more games to more and more streaming partners. I mean, MLS is on Apple TV Plus. That's crazy. If you're a big hockey fan, now you have to pay for Apple. So the landscape is just messy and confusing. And the great irony is, after all the cord cutting and the fragmentation, I think we're going to see a rebundling. I look at the fact that VENU is trying to launch, but Fubo successfully stopped them temporarily because Fubo's like, it's not fair that they get to have just a skinny bundle. They get to have just the sports channels. So will Venue launch? Will we eventually see? I think yes. A big ass bundle where you just get all the sports stuff, a sports specific bundle. I want everything and we know we'll pay. Or even later down the road, will we see what everyone really wants? Tell me how much I'm going to have to pay to see every game that my team plays. I bet the pricing power on that would be enormous. Like, I don't want to have to go to Amazon or YouTube TV or Peacock. I just want to see every Patriots game. Tell me what I have to pay. I'd probably pay $1,000 a season, honestly, for it to just alleviate the headache. If it was just one app, and I know that on that one app, I can see every Patriots game. But then the problem is you get into this, out of market and in market and national game. I mean, the worst is sometimes on a Sunday at 1, I can't watch the Patriots because I don't live in the region where my team plays. I live in Connecticut. Sucks. The local game is the Jets or the Giants. Hate that. So that's going to have to get fixed long-term in a consumer-friendly way.
Lots of stuff for sure. There'll be lots of ink spilled, figurative ink spilled on that in 2025 and beyond for sure. All right, Dan, I have fun. We're at sidebars. Now your chance to take over the podcast. Tell us your social media all-star to follow. Just tell us who they are, what platform they're on, and why they're following.
Wow, social media all-stars. Cool. Boy, I really should have looked at these lightning round questions before we did this.
It could be anyone. It could be a blogger even. It could be a podcaster. It could be a Twitter, Blue Skies, Threads, LinkedIn, TikTok, anything you want.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that for me, big picture, Twitter is still the one. And I know there's a lot of junk on there now. There's fake news, there's misleading stuff, there's porn, there's tweets that are intentionally fake, parody accounts. And one of our writers has written about this a lot and is very fascinated by this and has reported on the problems with social media lately, and that is AJ Perez. His handle is by AJ Perez. So he just recently did a story about, for all of the claims of people saying, I'm leaving Twitter, it's successful, I'm going to Blue Sky. No, they're not. The focus of sports chatter is still Twitter. Sports Twitter has not moved to Blue Sky. Most of the leagues aren't even on Blue Sky still, or they don't have an account, or if they do, they're not active. So follow AJ for more on that. Again, I'm hesitant to pick too many FOS people because then you didn't name others, but I will shout out one other FOS staffer simply because he has really embraced doing more video stuff on LinkedIn and on Twitter and trying more experimental things on social. And that is David Rumsey. His handle is one of those that has an underscore first, and then it's David Rumsey. He's a golf specialist. He's one of our newsletter writers, so he writes multiple stories every day. And he's been very good about jumping on camera and doing a quick video to talk to you about his stories. So both of them are good. Of course, there's a whole sports media posse. that is all over this stuff. They live and breathe it. Another person who's good on that beat, besides our own Mike McCarthy, is Ryan Glassfeagel. He's currently at the Post. He's good on Twitter, gets a lot of scoops, thoughtful, smart guy. And then if you expand out, like just another, I guess I'm just naming people who I think are also must follow people on the beat. But there's Sarah Germano, and she's been on this beat a long time. She focuses on apparel. She has just left the Financial Times to join The Information, and that's a great hire for them. So she's a good follow on Twitter. There's a lot of like old school types. When it comes to sports betting, I think Dustin Gauker is someone that more people should follow. Gouker. He's on Twitter. He knows his stuff. He is constantly posting interesting stuff in the DraftKings FanDuel sports betting world, you know?
Oh yeah.
Just a few.
Oh yeah, that was a ton of great shout outs there. I want you to build a Twitter list for me and a Blue Sky starter pack.
Oh man, Blue Sky. Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, I'll give you one other name, non-Twitter. I was very Twitter heavy and I was very reporter heavy. There's a guy, a content creator who does college football stuff on Instagram, and we have partnered with him recently on a few things. So a little bit, I'm naming an FOS, someone in the FOS family, but his name is Adam Brenneman. And he is a former Penn State college football player. He's big on Instagram. He interviews coaches. His stuff is great.
Oh yeah, I like that one. I've come across this stuff before. And how about you, Dan? Where do we find you, as well as all the FOS platforms out there? You don't need to name all of them, but just the ones you want to shout out. And at FOS is pretty easy to find most places too.
Yes, we have the FOS handle on Twitter, which is great. Instagram, you have to write it out in full. It's Front Office Sports. We're on TikTok, Front Office Sports. We're on all the things. Specifically, we've been doing a lot of interesting stuff lately on LinkedIn, and it is interesting to me how LinkedIn has really grown as more of a social platform. LinkedIn is less cringe and less embarrassing than it's ever been. It's not just for suits. So find us on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at Read Dan Wright. That's been my column my whole Twitter life since 2007. And I like my handle. I'm pleased with my head. Sometimes I've had people say, "Oh, you should change it to reflect the place you work." So when I was running a website called Decrypt, they said it should be Dan Decrypt. No, I'm Read Dan Wright.
Oh yeah.
So find me on there. And then Instagram, I mostly, it's photos of my dog and my baby, but some work stuff. And I'm Danny Robs on Instagram, and I'm public on there.
Very nice. Check again, if you're listening to this podcast and not following FOS already all over the place, you're doing it wrong. So start that. And I've known the at Read Dan Wright handle since forever, and it's awesome to be able to put a face to the name and be able to speak to a real life man. So really cool to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for giving us some of your time and wisdom today, Dan.
Thank you. I would tell all your listeners, don't be shy. I have an open door policy. I'm kind of busy these days, but I do, when I get reader emails, I respond.
Love it.
Thanks so much again to Dan Roberts, editor-in-chief of FOS. Just tremendous stuff today. Cannot thank him enough for giving up his time, his wisdom, his insight. Continue to follow FOS, of course. Continue to read Dan. He does those great weekend columns as well as other projects for FOS. And cannot thank him enough for coming on the podcast today. But that'll do it for this episode of the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast. Thanks again for listening. As always, I'm your host, Neil Horwitz. You can find me on Twitter at NJ287, also on LinkedIn, the website, dsmsports.net. Also check out Slyke, SLYKE.co. And until next time, this is Neil Horwitz signing off for the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast.